Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I am Alicia Latoris, the Friends of Art Curatorial Research Assistant here at the Davis Museum and co-curator of Hidden Histories Revealing the Life of a Painting. I am thrilled to welcome you to the Fall 2019 Davis Discoveries program featuring our newly acquired 16th century Venetian Sacra Conversazione. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Davis Museum at Wellesley College is located on the ancestral and unceded tribal lands of the Massachusetts people. We acknowledge the continuing presence of the Massachusetts and their relatives and neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples, and pay respect to the Indigenous elders past and present. Today's Davis Discoveries is the culmination of a research project that began in the spring of 2017 and evolved into the exhibition Hidden Histories Revealing the Life of a Painting. Both the symposium today and the exhibition have been made possible by the expertise and generosity of many. I would like to extend my sincerest gratitude to Peter H. and Joan Macy Caskell, class of 1953, for their generous donation of the painting, as well as funding for its conservation, the exhibition, and related programming. Thank you. I would also like to thank Save Venice for their generous contribution to this event, and also extend my deepest condolences to the city of Venice right now while they are going through such a trying time with the flooding. We would also like to thank the Tillis and Delorme family, the Davis Museum Friends of Art, the Paintings Conservation Team at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, particularly Rona Macbeth and Lydia Vatz, who will be presenting on the fascinating technical analysis of the work. For their expertise and guidance on this research project, I would like to thank Professor Jackie Mazzacchio, Professor Emerita Lillian Armstrong, Professor Emeritus Peter Ferguson, Frederick Ilchman of the MFA Boston, Vincent Deluvian of the Louvre, and Claire Whitner of the Worcester Art Museum. I would like to thank the entire staff of the Davis Museum, without whom this exhibition and symposium would not have been possible, especially our director, Lisa Fishman, our senior curator, Amanda Gilvin, our exhibitions manager, Mark Beeman, and our manager of education, Arthurina Fears. And finally, I would like to extend a special thank you to Kate Davies, my co-curator and presenter here today, and acknowledge her careful research and invaluable contributions to the exhibition Hidden Histories Revealing the Life of a Painting. The Davis Discoveries program began prior to our reinstallation of our permanent collection galleries in 2016 to highlight the research and conservation of particular works of note in the Davis collections, and to emphasize not only our newfound knowledge on these objects, but also the important collaborations between curators, conservators, scholars, and students. When the Davis first accepted the gift of this Sacra Conversazione, we knew it would be the perfect work to feature in a Davis Discoveries. In April of 2017, the Castells offered the painting to the Davis, and we gladly accepted. We were grateful that they also offered funds for conservation, as we expected that it would need to be cleaned before it could be displayed in the galleries. Before coming to the Davis, the painting was sent to the Paintings Conservation Team at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston to begin the conservation process. The conservators at the MFA undertook a technical examination of the painting to determine if and how the surface of the work could be cleaned. Lydia Vatz and Kate Davies will discuss the process and findings in greater detail later this afternoon, so I will not say too much here, but I will give a quick spoiler. After reviewing the x-rays and the paint samples, it was decided that we would not proceed with the cleaning the panel, as it has a very fragile surface and there are multiple areas of overpaint that cover presumably extensive damage. So while much of today is devoted to the conservation of the work, it is to the technical analysis and what was discovered beneath the surface of the painting. The work you see on view in the galleries is the work as it was donated to the museum. Regardless of the lack of cleaning, the resultant imaging from the technical examination proved fascinating, and the provenance research greatly deepened our understanding and reading of the painting. So much so, we thought not only would this make an excellent Davis Discoveries, but also a wonderful exhibition to highlight the intersection of conservation and art history, and allow for our viewers, particularly students, to see the breadth and possibility of object-based research. I hope you will take the time this afternoon to view Hidden Histories on the second floor if you have not already. I am also thrilled to announce that Hidden Histories has been extended and will be on view in the spring semester. So if you do not have time today, I urge you to come back before it closes in June. We were particularly excited to receive this painting as our collection of Venetian paintings from the Renaissance is lean, and this work is emblematic of a popular Venetian type, the Sacra Conversazione, or Sacred Conversation, featuring the Madonna and Child surrounded by saints and often a donor figure. The artist of this painting is not currently known, despite its dubious attribution to Giorgione in the 19th century. Ultimately, the centuries of retouching and alteration have obscured the hand of the original artist. In April of 2017, I began to research the painting and started not with possible attribution, but with the iconography and provenance. In the files provided by the Cascels, there were notes from an art historian's research into the provenance in the 1960s, as well as notes about another similar composition in the Musée du Louvre in Paris. If you have been to the Louvre, you have very much likely seen this painting, but you probably don't remember it. It is situated on the opposite wall next to the Mona Lisa. So you were probably fighting the crowds around the Mona Lisa and not paying attention to what was directly to its right. I uncovered more information about the version of the Louvre attributed to Sebastiano del Piombo and located 4 other versions of the composition, all of which contain the same figural grouping with minor variations. The other versions are almost identical in composition, figures, and landscape, and the Davis panel is so far the only outlier with a different landscape, which is comprised of a small town instead of a mountain, and the donor figure in the bottom center, who is a different man. While the production of multiple versions of a composition or copies of a specific work were typical in the Renaissance, questions started to arise as to why our panel seems to be the only deviation from the theme. Kate Davies will give a more complete overview of the issues and answers found so far in her presentation later this afternoon. In addition to the provenance research, technical analysis provided views beneath the surface layer of paint and varnish to construct a more complete history of the work, but the Sacra Conversazione still holds many mysteries. Questions remain on the identity of the donor figure, and further examination of the other versions would elucidate the changes apparent in the Davis painting. The 500 years of history embedded in this panel contain many avenues still to explore, though many of our first questions will be answered through the presentations today. So we are delighted to welcome 3 wonderful presenters to campus today. The first is Dr. Frederick Ilchman, the chair of the Art of Europe Department, and Mrs. Russell W. Baker, curator of paintings at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. A specialist in Italian art, particularly that of Venice, Dr. Ilchman has been a curator at the MFA Boston since 2001 and chair of the Art of Europe since 2014. He holds an A.B. in art history from Princeton and a Ph.D. from Columbia. His exhibitions include Titian Tintoretto Veronese, Rivals in Renaissance Venice of 2009, organized with the Louvre, and Goya, Order and Disorder of 2014, which the Wall Street Journal selected as one of the year's best. He also serves as chairman of Save Venice, and the largest nonprofit organization dedicated to the preservation of the art and architecture of Venice. We are pleased to see a number of Save Venice members and supporters in the audience today. Last year, marking Tintoretto's 500th birthday, Frederick co-curated exhibition on the artist for Venice's Palazzo Ducale and the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Frederick also has Wellesley credentials. He lived on the campus as a child in the mid-1970s when his mother, Alice Stone Ilchman, was dean of the college, and his wife, Cassandra Johnson, is a member of the class of 2000. Our second presenter, Lydia Vatz, is the Cunningham Associate Conservator of Paintings at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. She trained in Italy before getting a master's in art conservation at the University of Delaware through the Winterthur program. Since graduating, she has worked in museums all across Massachusetts, including the Strauss Center at Harvard, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Williamstown Art Conservation Center, and has worked on projects for the Worcester Art Museum and Historic New England. Her projects at the MFA have included cleaning the Sargent murals in the Rotunda and Colonnade, numerous large-scale paintings in the conservation and action space, and works by artists ranging from Titian to Sargent to Van Gogh. Our final talk is from Catherine Davies, a recent graduate of Wellesley College, class of 2019. She currently works as a Museum Partnerships Growth Associate at QZM. While at Wellesley, she worked at the Davis Museum in almost every possible capacity as a student. She was a student guide for all 4 years, giving tours of the permanent collections and special exhibitions to visiting groups, was a member of the Davis Student Advisory Committee, serving as the co-coordinator her senior year. She worked as a student assistant in the curatorial department during the school year, was a curatorial intern for the summer of 2017, and returned after her senior year as the summer 2019 Eleanor P. DeLorme Museum intern in the curatorial department, during which time she was the co-curator of Hidden Histories, Revealing the Life of a Painting. So this afternoon, we will start with Dr. Ilchman, who will place our painting in the context of 16th century Venice, particularly within the type of the Sacra Conversazione. We will continue with Lydia Watts, who will present on her technical analysis of the painting, and conclude with Catherine Davies, who will give an overview of what we have learned about the painting through research and the technical analysis. There will be time for questions after the three presentations have concluded, and we will end with a reception in the lobby of the Davis Museum across the way. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Frederick Ilchman.
Buongiorno. Please, Wellesley College, you can do better. Buongiorno. Buongiorno. Excellent. Okay. Really a pleasure to be here. And as Alicia just reminded us, though, it's important to remember Venice today. This has been a terrible week, and the prognosis isn't great. Talking to people on the phone in Venice and via email is that our beloved city is really taken on the chin. This is a Acqua Alta tidal flood, perhaps just a notch less destructive from the famous one in 1966, which really turned the world's attention to Venice. And indeed, we need to obviously keep Venice in the center, right in our hearts. And also remember, of course, the role of Wellesley College. This is an important connection with Say Venice. There are many people in this room, including Peter and Lillian, who have a long leadership role with Say Venice, and of course, important part of the college community. But the real founders of Say Venice, John McAndrew and his wife, Betty Bartlett McAndrew, of course, were here, indeed, in the predecessor institution of the Davis. In fact, they're buried in Venice, and on my next trip, I want to make sure I see that their grave was in good shape. I try to visit it every time I go to Venice. We're thinking of Venice, of course, and thinking of this little conference is, in fact, about to celebrate an intriguing acquisition from Peter H. and Joan Macy Caskell, class of 1953. Grazie di nuovo. And on a week like this, with Venice feeling quite threatened, this painting is a little piece of Renaissance Venice here in Wellesley, and indeed I find that idea, in fact, even comforting. As you'll hear more, this is a picture that is indeed compromised, maybe, by its condition. It has been loved, maybe too well loved, over the years. It's been altered, probably, to, each restoration is, in a sense, an interpretation. So there have been a number of restorations, possibilities of other damage on purpose or inadvertent. So it is a painting, a little piece of Renaissance Venice, once beautiful, now damaged, nevertheless continuously fascinating, and a great teaching object, as we'll get to in the three presentations today. It opens up interesting windows to the worlds of art history, science, history of taste, and the tasks of the art conservator and the art historian. So let's go over briefly the painting you see on the screen. And you can see, so we've got the Virgin and Child there, child looking down at a donor who looks right out at us. He's really the figure most connecting to us, a kind of interlocutor bringing us into the picture. There's a female saint, and then on the right is really kind of blocking a good portion of the beautiful landscape is the wonderful figure of St. Sebastian, nude to the waist, right, with his arrows that wounded him but did not strike any vital organs, and therefore he survived. One question, Alicia, is the woman holding an arrow?
She is, but it looks like it's overpainted.
Oh dear. Okay, but because maybe others will talk about this, but just struck that she's St. Catherine. If there's a wheel, didn't see a wheel. It looked like an arrow, and if it is an old arrow, that would make her St. Ursula. But you can see even the attribution's a question. There's a lot of fascinating things going on, including identification of the figures. Then upper left, a figure. A face of an older man, which is very distinctly done. It looks quite different than the other figures, and that would be, say, Joseph. It is interesting just how they're crammed into a space. It's quite closely cropped, and there is a big curtain behind. A little hard to register when you see it much more readily in the original, but then there is a bit of rock and the trees, so it's a quite enclosing or focusing attention on the left hand. and then kind of right at the barrier is where you have the interaction between Christ looking down at the donor. Now, I've left the label, the caption here comes from the website. We're called Giorgione School of or After, and which is a relatively broad topic or consideration, and I suggest that in fact this attribution is not one we really need to think further, except that it's a traditional one. But before we look at Giorgione, I just want to point out that one really interesting part of its provenance is when this painting was auctioned in London in 1912, Christie Manson Woods, and so Sir William James Farrar. So a major collection. That's the auction catalog. This is the description of our Giorgione painting, Holy Family with Saints. Now, notice it's not called there Sacra Conversazione. That's what art historians would use as a kind of shorthand, and I'll get to that more in a minute, but so it's described right down there. So this is a very key bit in knowing the history of this picture. This was an important sale. The owner also sold paintings, some with quite elevated or indeed optimistic attributions. But one thing that came out of it, in fact, is an important, very late Claude Lorrain, right at the end of his career, that hangs at the Museum of Fine Arts. But I wanted to point out this photograph, which Alicia shared, was part of the research on this painting. And it's reproduced, actually, same photographs reproduced in an article by Bernard Berenson, but it's demonstrably the same painting, but very much altered. Among other things, the body of St. Sebastian is quite a bit different, and he's wearing unusual, the loincloth, which Professor Musacchio described as bloomers. That is not present in the Louvre painting, is quite a bit different. But also, this is if you want to make this a painting of Giorgione, this is how you would overpaint or retouch it, making everything quite soft, sort of fleshy, soft skin, a real sense of kind of a dreamy, kind of fairy tale almost mood. And you think of things like with Giorgione, I mean, we're on very shifty sand here, but this is one of the very, very few fixed points. The artist dies in 1510. We're only, there are 11 paintings by him, 12, some depends how you count. I mean, he makes Vermeer look like Mr. Prolific in comparison. But in this sort of saying, you have the detachment of the Madonna and Child, the beautiful landscape, which is just like the Veneto, rural vistas there, and again, the sort of fairy tale or sort of detached or dreamy maybe quality of the figures. I could see that if the way the Saint Sebastian was repainted might have been to emphasize this kind of connection. But in a sense, any painter of the 16th century in Venice is somehow school of Giorgione, just like you'd be school of Bellini. It's impossible to ignore those influences, but I don't think that's particularly relevant. I wish I had a great answer, and this is a spoiler. I'm not going to be able to say, come up with some, Venetian school follower of so-and-so in this date. One of the goals when I came and studied this painting earlier in the week with a number of people, a number of experts, was I was hoping we could say at least the decade, right? But the key thing that we know, of course, is that it's related to the picture in the Louvre. Let's think about that further. So, now, this painting is itself a bit of an attribution question in that several major scholars say it's actually not Sebastiano del Piombo, it's somebody else. Now, Giovanni Bellini, in his later career, had three great pupils, right? He had Giorgione, Sebastiano del Piombo, and Titian. So all three of them passed through Giovanni Bellini's workshop. And it's in importance very much related to that, in level, let's say, of the great workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, who produced Lorenzo Costa, Perugino, and of course, Leonardo da Vinci. So this is an example of a really great artist, Giovanni Bellini, who also was the right kind of crucible or laboratory for the most ambitious artists of the next generation to train. I completely believe this is Sebastiano. I know that this is doubted by some people. The Louvre calls it Sebastiano, and it is. It just, the sort of proud Virgin Mary, big, monumental, big neck to that. Look at the very fleshy, dreamy St. Sebastian at the right. There's a solidity, that massive fold of drapery, the green that comes down from the Virgin Mary's shoulder and rests on her lap. These are big, bulky things you see again and again in Sebastiano. But his work is hard to figure out. He leaves Venice in 1511 to go to Rome. He's clearly picked as the great art. You could have tried to get Titian, but no. The Pope's banker wanted Sebastiano, so he leaves the Venetian context. He was clearly a top artist, but with that terminus of 1511, it's not clear when everything when he actually painted things. I'm giving it the date 1508, but it could be 7 or 6 even, so that's kind of hard. This is very famous altarpiece on the Church of San Giovanni Crisostomo, the high altar there. But the big bulky draperies, the same female type, right? Big thick necks, proud, beautiful faces. There's a wonderful dreamy sense in the St. John the Baptist, the kind of way that the orange drapery winds around his body in a kind of double helix or single helix, just like the banderole, where it says Ecce Agnus Dei, winds up around his reed cross. The landscape, I mean, I think there's a lot of nice comparisons to the Louvre version, which is the painting, of course, the departure point for the Davis picture. Or this, so we dated this 1507-8, again, has to be before 11, right? But it's, and then this is organ shutters. Now this is kind of relevant to us though. Organ shutters is a very Venetian type. These are large paintings on canvas to cover the pipes of the organ when the organ is not being played. Keeps away from dust, and so this is when it's not played, and they come together to make this beautiful arch. By the way, total cutting-edge architecture. This is the most up-to-date sort of Roman influence, maybe a little Bramante in that architecture. On the right, Sebastiano is Saint Sebastian. So always keep in mind when an artist does his or her, name saint, right? So we've got Sebastian painting himself, in a sense, that extraordinary almost explosion, that sort of tissue effect of all the white drapery, but then the really fleshy body and the turn of slight turn of his waist and his torso, the contrapposto, the weight on a single foot. These are all kind of classic things, examples of high Renaissance, and I feel that is in the same realm as the Louvre painting. So I think Sebastiano. Remember, there are other paintings that look more like the Louvre painting, but those are not as solidly Sebastiano as these. So just make the comparisons with works that are, really, really firm. So now let's look at these two together, and not to be disappointing, but if you do apples to apples comparisons, what does strike you is that the painting on the right in the Louvre is probably more beautiful, figure for figure, and certainly better condition than the Davis picture. But there are some exceptions, and those I'll talk about in a second. But it's really the exact same thing. St. Joseph in profile, large monumental Virgin Mary looking down at Christ child, female saint, and then Sebastian. Now the biggest difference, right, the most obvious, besides one of condition, is that the donor portrait is looking out at us, not in profile. It's an unbearded figure. Indeed, it's a different person. And so that's another question. So why would you have a painting just like this other one, but personalize it? I mean, if you're going to personalize it, put yourself in it, wouldn't you switch the saints around? Because we assume that the Louvre one was painted first. The bearded guy at the right, he not only would have said, put my portrait in, but he would have picked the saints. And I wouldn't be surprised if his name was Sebastiano himself, because you have Saint Sebastian so prominently. One thing to keep in mind is Sebastian and San Rocco are saints generally associated with protection from the plague, and Venice, above many cities, as a port, it got diseases first, right? It's one of the first places to be hit by the Black Death, etc. So they really worried about that, and one kind of, sort of healthcare program, in effect, what was to commission many paintings and sculptures and prints and proliferate images of these saints in order for them to take the disease and save the city. So there might be a kind of question of plague related, or indeed the person's name might well be Sebastian. One thing also, the female saint is Catherine. Just to throw out, Caterino as a male name is not totally unknown. There are some, it's not just Caterina as Catherine, there's also Caterino as a male name. So you wonder, because she is directly above his head, maybe that would be another source of his identity. So they are just about the same in dimension, though the Davis picture is a little longer, and you can see exactly what happened. You get the whole tree, plus some of the view of the landscape on the far side of that. So let's look at the Sebastians. Now, when you look at this, you see that the Sebastian on the left is much harder and it seems more gaunt, and it's not the big fleshy sort of dreamy face of the Sebastiano picture in the Louvre, he's also looking at us and not kind of staring off. Indeed, an odd thing about the Louvre is, what is Sebastian doing there? Why isn't he kind of looking in on the composition or forming a better bookend? A difficulty, though, because my first idea would be that this figure, the Davis, was you had a very cutting-edge composition and treatment in the Sebastiano. Then in the Davis, the artist of the Davis picture, right, was a rather conservative, maybe even an archaic or retarded-taire painter who did his version of it, right, in a kind of taut, thinner mode, right? And you could go even further and say, you know what? Isn't it interesting how the amount of loincloth, it's almost exactly the same distance from the navel down, but the pattern of the drapery is very different. So one might think, as I did initially, aha, this was not copied from the Louvre directly, but from a drawing of the one in the Louvre. And that makes sense, that if you were an artist and you had 10 minutes to look at the Louvre painting, because you knew that some person, the donor portrait right here, wanted one. He said, hey, make me one like that, but put me in the donor position, obviously. That's what you might do. You'd give a little indication for the knot and the general size of the loincloth, but not indicate precisely where the folds go. The problem is, and Lydia Vox, the esteemed paintings conservator who speaks next, will make clear that very little of this figure is original. So those kind of bets are off, unfortunately. There was definitely a Sebastian there, but what he precisely looked like, it is hard to explain. So this is the two portraits, and you will hear in a bit how this figure was of the donor. The person who paid for the picture was originally in profile and then looked out at us. And that's another question. In a way, making more direct contact might be seen as a little more modern or up-to-date way of doing a donor. That is, in strict profile, that's what you'd have on tombs and images of doges, and earlier, pre-1500 images in Venice would often have the donors, or indeed even independent portraits, were done in profile. So this might be an indication. But again, we will have to wait for the conservator to explain which parts of this are in fact intact enough to make those comments with some security. But one other thing to point out just is, notice how the little Christ child, the painting in the Louvre, the right leg goes over the left leg, does not here. And indeed, that might have been a kind of, let's say, time-saving effort during a later restoration, right? The foot is not in great shape. Maybe let's just stick it behind, or in effect, make it look like that. So that's another thing. But going through this, you really just see just how similar they are. I mean, there's no way that the painting and the Davis could have been done without knowledge of the existence of the one at the Louvre. So this is one point, let's say, where the story becomes a little more optimistic, because you can see it a little bit in the slides, but you can surely see it in the original, which is the landscape in the Louvre painting is this one big kind of mountain that comes up oddly a bit like the prow of a ship, whereas they're beautiful little town or little houses painted in white paint between the female saint and Sebastian, and those are quite beautifully done. And there are other details. There is a squirrel up in the upper right section of the Davis picture. You see where the extra landscape is visible. There's a deer down below. There's quite attractive foliage and ivy that's running up the side. All of those show an artist of some real talent, and so it is disappointing or a pity that some of that presumed talent, which would underlie other parts of the picture, has been largely obscured. But the landscape is an interesting point of detail, and that makes sense too, whether it's the artist trying to be innovative, or maybe the client said, oh yeah, put my face in there, because I'm the one who paid for the picture, but also, please, do what you want with the landscape, or maybe even refer to a specific landscape. Now, it's not detailed enough that we could know, oh, this is a certain town on the mainland, or a certain village where, say, the owner of this painting might have had agricultural lands or family came from or something. But it's specific enough, I believe, that the owner would have been able to make that connection. So something else just to keep in mind. And then we look here at the figures. Again and again, the Davis picture is simplified, little less monumental, but very much done in that same spirit. And this should make clear to you, on the right, the picture in the Louvre, the St. Joseph, the bearded man, and the Virgin Mary, are done by the same hand. Here, we've got two different persuasions, and Alicia was pointing that out so well. This really looks like a much later painting, like a 19th or even early 20th century head of St. Joseph. So that's been doctored up quite a bit. So now we've got several different campaigns of restoration. We've got possibilities of more than one artist, and you might say, oh dear, how is he going to finish this lecture, right? So I'm going to finish this lecture by putting this in a broader context to think about image making, not just in Renaissance Italy, but more specifically in Venice. And we are going to explore this painting and also just think about what is so interesting right off the bat in either version, leaving aside condition or attribution, is what a crazy, really packed composition it is. All those figures crammed into a tightly cropped space. They're jostling for room, these individuals. This is, as I said earlier, what we call a Sacra Conversazione, and I'll get more of that in detail. But we're going to explore where this subject matter, or this format, you might say, of Italian art, really Venetian painting, where did it originate? And we're going to use the Davis, of course, Davis picture as our jumping off point. Now, before we get to that, though, you might be thinking that there's a straightforward explanation for the divergence in quality. How you get from the one at the right to the one at the left is that the one on the left was done by someone in Sebastiano's workshop, right? Would have had a number of pupils, and time was short, and maybe the client didn't have a lot of money and said, okay, you think you're getting a Sebastiano, but you're getting one of my assistants because I got to work on this altarpiece over here, right? So there's that kind of scenario, and that in many cases, that is indeed what happened. Let me show you some senses going back a generation to his teacher, Giovanni Bellini. So, Madonna and the Little Trees. It's dated 1487, as if it's been carved. It's a trompe l'oeil carving, engraving in the green marble parapet there. And this is complicated because this is the first dated Bellini painting. He might have been as old as his mid to late 50s when this was done. And so you can see how tough it is for us to date Bellini's work, where this is really the first fixed point we have. All the work he did in his 20s, 30s, 40s, and early 50s is not only undated, but maybe even to some degree undateable. It's quite complicated. But what I want you to pay particular attention here is just how beautifully the figures, or the hands overlap, and I love the motif of the right arm of the Christ child resting over the wrist of his mother. It's just such a beautiful thing. There's a real wonderful three-dimensionality about this, and this is the kind of motif that I could really think that Bellini was looking at relief sculpture, including Donatello, remember, who comes to Padua, but there's a real sculptural sense of this. But leaving that aside, keep in mind this motif, and then exact same motif, right? All we've done is substitute the landscape for now saints on either side. And so we have St. Paul on the left and St. George on the right. The one on the right, in fact, the figure, he has a quite particular face, and indeed that might be a donor portrait disguised really as a saint. So this is an example of reworking a nice composition, a successful composition, you might say, a really beautiful, touching one, and then sort of substituting the saints to make it suitable for specific commission. So that's one question. You've got something produced by the workshop. And indeed, there's a little signature there at the bottom. This is called a cartellino. It's a little piece of imitation or fictive paper. It's actually just in paint, but it looks like a piece of paper that's been stuck to the bottom edge, the so-called parapet that separates the world of the painting from our world in real space. And you might say, well, the first one was signed, the second one was signed. How can they look so different? Because indeed, this seems quite derivative, and I would say is mostly done by someone in Bellini's shop. To explain this, the signature is not evidence that Bellini himself painted. No, he would have delegated lots of sections of his painting, in addition to mixing and grinding colors and washing brushes and making coffee. There were assistants, there were pupils that did lots of specific tasks. But this signature doesn't say Bellini himself did it. It just says that this painting was up to the level of the shop. It met the high standards as a sort of, let's say, a consistent product of the Bellini bottega or workshop. And the analogy might be that when you're going to an expensive restaurant run by a celebrity chef, the idea is not that this famous person, Lydia Shire or Todd English or someone, Alan Ducasse, is actually making your meal. No. But that person trained the staff, developed all the preparations, selected the menu, maybe even designed the physical space, but really ran this so the restaurant could run at a high, consistent level. So you'd have the brand be maintained. Of course, then we get to another sort of paradox that the waiter will describe so-and-so's signature dish, right? Implying that the person actually made it, him or herself. When you know 100% they did not. So but the signature is this kind of funny idea. This just shows how we are, even today in 2019, invested with the creativity or the touch of a single person who signs the work. Now, I can make another way of showing this. So there's the close-up of the two, but you can also just see how different the Christ child's face are. I mean, that's the same pose, right? But very different handling of light and proportions, etc. And then over here, now let's look in the foreground in this Bellini painting again. And some of these dates are just our best guesses. But here we have Pietà. So it's the dead adult Christ on his mother's lap. This comes after Michelangelo's sculpture, not by much, by a few years. But of course, the tricky thing is how do you actually fit an adult male on the lap of his mother, because the poignant idea is that just like she cradled the little baby sleeping, now she's cradling her son who has been killed, but it can't look awkward. And Michelangelo does it with his sculpture in the Vatican by wrapping the marble body of Christ around the enormous lap of the Virgin Mary. Kind of the same thing here. She's made into a huge pyramid so she can take this figure. Also notice how his thighs of Christ are considerably shortened, much shorter than the shins. It's a way of kind of manipulating the space. But so there's the artist of this is an artist, a painter who has a style that can be quite gaunt, appropriate to the subject matter of dead Christ and a grieving mother. But also notice in the background there is a city, and you can see things that look like parts of Vicenza or Padua, and it's a very spiky city. See that? It's got lots of little turrets and little dormers and gables, and it's very detailed. Now, compared to this, also Bellini, here also signed. Now everything, the drapery now is much more crinkly. The faces are soft and in a kind of really coming out of a gloom. The figures are a little pudgier. And look in the background, the city, not spiky at all. In fact, it's very smooth. It's almost like you took sort of clay, wet clay, and sort of covered every surface in that town. So are we talking about Bellini doing the figures, but in two different modes, and then two different specialists doing the backgrounds, right? One does the spiky backgrounds, and someone else, his style would be to do smooth backgrounds. So we could be talking about four different artists at work on these two panels from roughly the same time. So that's a very interesting kind of question. And then further, you can see that as a workshop was really churning things out, sometimes let's say the high standards were not always maintained. You get a failure in supervision if you look at something like this. So this is a painting owned by the Metropolitan Museum, which you might remember was in our 2009 exhibition, Titian, Tintoretto, Veronese, Rivals in Renaissance Venice. It is now a half-length, like these other Madonna and Child pictures, but you can tell rather than standing, this is a quotation from a enthroned or seated Madonna and Child. And, there's not enough, it's kind of odd that it's as if it's an enthroned Madonna, probably from an altarpiece that's being readapted for this. Notice St. Peter on the left. What is he doing? He's looking out of the picture. He's kind of been plucked out of another painting, but not really knitted well into the composition. The woman behind, the female martyr saint, she's oversized. Doesn't she seem a little bit out of scale? And then John the Baptist is doing his job. He's pointing at the Virgin Mary and pointing at Christ, but he also seems a little bit off. I mean, he's really been plucked out of a baptism. And so what you see here are figures that are individually beautifully painted, but they've been excerpted from works by the master and not fully assembled into a greater whole. So this is yet another example. It's not, you wouldn't look at this individual figures and say, oh, poor quality, this must be a Bellini workshop assistant, or even this is a copyist or some later artist, someone in the Bellini orbit, circle of, but not someone who studied with him. But in this case, the problem really is within the execution of the overall composition. And I remind you, there is that cartellino. There is that signature right in the foreground saying that this is Giovanni Bellini. So you can see already how complicated this is. And there are no signatures, by the way, on any of Sebastiano's paintings during his time in Venice. So that means these are all value judgments, what I'm giving you. There's no scientific test that can say it's by a certain artist. It's just you make, a bit like impeachment, I suppose. You line up all your evidence and you hope that you are convincing. But this shows you here, with Bellini, just a whole wide range of works in quality, in scale, but all of the ones I've shown you would have been for private homes, right? None of these were for churches. These would have been pictures for probably bedrooms in wealthy or relatively wealthy people's homes. And the saints would have been personalized, chosen by the clients because they were that of their wife or their son or their sister or whatever. So they almost certainly relate to the client. So let's talk about this group, though, this term, which I've been calling Sacra Conversazione. And it's a confusing term, Sacra Conversazione, sacred conversation. One, because it's not really a period term. It really gets going in the 19th century. There are a few examples of Renaissance using the term sacred conversation to talk about a work of art. The other question, or the other difficulty, is it's not a conversation. No one is saying anything, right? There's no speaking going on. So we have to translate this in a better way, not sacred conversation, but Sacra Conversazione as maybe a holy community. And we're particularly talking about this category, which you have seen lots of, and the Davis painting is one of, Virgin and Child with saints from different time periods. That is, it is not recognizing or replicating any particular historical moment when these certain saints came. No, these are saints from out of time, right? So you've got medieval saints like St. Francis, could be in the same space, the same composition as saints from the time of Christ, like John the Baptist. But I found in the Grove Dictionary of Art a quite good definition, which I will, if you don't mind, I'll read, because I think this is quite useful at some of the nuances of the category. Sacra Conversazione, term applied to a type of religious painting depicting the Virgin and Child flanked on either side by saints, which developed during the 15th and 16th centuries and is associated primarily with the Italian Renaissance. The specific characteristics of the genre are that the figures, who are of comparable physical dimensions, seem to coexist, that's key, within the same space and light, are aware of each other and share a common emotion. This relationship is conveyed with greater or lesser emphasis by gesture and expression. The compositions are usually frontal and centralized and are distinguished by an aura of stillness and meditation. So this idea of them being aware of each other, being in the same space, the same light. And so let's not think of Sacra Conversazione as sacred conversation so much as holy community or holy gathering. Let's think about how this type evolved. Let's go back to really early panel painting in Venice, so the middle of the Trecento, or the 1300s. So this is the famous Santa Chiara polyptych in the Accademia, currently being restored by Say Venice this autumn. We've got Life of St. Clare up top, and in fact there's a number of little teeny figures, little figures of a nun. She would have been the person that paid for this. She is the client of this. And then it's Life of Christ in the lower two registers, and the Coronation of the Virgin in the middle. Make it a little easier on you there. And so what we have is a polyptych, a multi-compartment painting. And there's a lot going on. You read it from left to right like you do a book, but it's many, many different saints, and it's all about storytelling. Even the center field, right, is not the Virgin Child just sitting there. It is the Christ crowning his mother, Queen of Heaven. So that is a narrative or action moment. So that's the kind of beginning there. Lots of little compartments. Polyptych then evolves. This is another Say Venice restoration. Actually very pleased that the Boston Young Friends paid for this about 12 years ago, and I think Lillian and Peter were at the black tie party that paid for this, so thank you. But this is Michele de Matteo, a Bolognese artist who works in Venice, and now you've got single female saints, right? This was for a convent. Single female saints, each in their own compartment there. We've got the evangelist up top, and then crucifixion in the center. And it's St. Helen and the discovery of the true cross running along in that bottom strip, the predella. And there you see the saints. So these figures, they're all the same size. You can see they arguably are on the same platform, that marble platform. The Virgin Mary being the Virgin, she gets a fancier thing. She's got a carpet on hers. But there's a sense that even if they're in separate compartments, separated by these little colonnettes and each in their own Gothic arches, they are in the same space and potentially aware of each other. this is an important reminder. So a little bit later, so Bartolomeo Verini painting at the Church of the Frari. And this reminds us that it's not always a Virgin and Child in the center of your Sacra Conversazione. In this case, it is St. Mark, so it's the patron saint of Venice. That's a kind of regional variant. Hard to imagine that in Florence. St. Mark was not an important saint in Florence, but he was in Venice to the same degree. But look at this here. These figures, they are all demonstrably on that same platform, and they're now clustered such that the ones on the left form a kind of bookend, the ones on the right form a kind of bookend. If there was any speaking to happen, at least they could hear each other, right? So it's got there. But this is a very Gothic painting in the mid 1470s, and now we're looking at Renaissance paintings, rounded arches, all the types of architecture, right? These are classical architecture. We've got little column bases, shafts, capitals, but even though we've got sea and land, there's a sense that these figures are again, aware of each other, and the Annunciation, right, is happening. Angel Gabriel on the left, Virgin Mary receiving the Virgin Nunciate on the right, and then reminding what's happening in this, what will happen in the story, right? Long after Christ is born and teaches and preaches, you see the dead Christ there in the middle. But so the figures are getting larger, more monumental, closer to life size, and indeed the many divisions are breaking down. And then you see them right there, nice detail. Important breakthrough. I mean, Bellini may have done the first one in Venice around this time. Painting now was subsequently destroyed in a fire. Antonello Damascena, right, with a name like that, Damascena, comes from Sicily. This is just a fragment of what must have been a fantastic painting in the done in Venice for San Bartolomeo. It's now in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. All we have is the center section. You don't have any of the architecture, but the point is they are now, finally, what I said earlier, jostling for space. They're right, aware of each other. Their poses reflect each other, the gestures. They are looking at each other. So this is a really new thing. This really is the kind of holy community gathering around the Virgin and Child. There you see better the sense of three-dimensionality. Look how Christ on her lap is just like a sculpture. He comes right out to us in 3 dimensions, not flat or Byzantine at all. Really the power of oil paint to make beautiful modeling in light and shade to give a convincing volume to his figures. So, around the same time, maybe in the early 1480s, Giovanni Bellini does this wonderful picture, the San Giobbe altarpiece. So he's no longer situating his figures in many little compartments. Now they're all in one space, and indeed the space above is no longer a separate register, but indeed it's a fictive chapel, as if we're at a mosaic chapel like in San Marco. This has been moved from the Church of San Giobbe many years ago. It's now in the Accademia, and so it's missing its frame, but the actual stone frame is precisely that of the painted stone frame to make a very convincing illusion. So you see all the saints here, and I'll get you a little closer, just so you have a sense of just how beautiful. There's our Sebastian. It's a leaner type with Bellini, compared to his student Sebastiano. His Saint Sebastian, as you saw, is more beefy, but there's a real sense of these figures understanding each other. And these saints would have been chosen by the patron, as I keep emphasizing, to reflect the particular choices of the patron. That would be family names, certain saints that are very important, names of children, names of relatives, ancestors, or if this had been a corporate, that is a guild kind of commission, everyone who was on the art committee would have gotten their saints in this. So there's a sense of selecting things like that. This painting is so influential, the San Giobbe altarpiece. We don't know when it was made, but we'll guess reasonably early 1480s, but this is so influential that even when altarpiece paintings begin to move away from static compositions like this to narrative ones that are telling specific stories, they still look a lot like this. For example, same wall, same church. So this is Vittore Carpaccio, and it's now the presentation of Jesus in the temple. So the little boy is being brought to the high priest. And now, see, these are various onlookers and sort of attendant women holding the doves, etc. But this is exactly the same kind of composition. They are now gathered, these figures, in the same way on either side of the Madonna and Child in the middle that they were in the Bellini. Even the musician angels, the evocation of precious marbles and fancy mosaics up top, and even a hanging lamp, right? A little bit of illusion. Or look at this, again, same church, same wall, maybe as late as 30 years after the Giovanni Bellini's prototype. So now this is Agony in the Garden. So this is the episode where Christ asks his three most trusted disciples to keep a vigil with him after the Last Supper. He knows he's going to be captured. And of course, the disciples fall asleep. They can't stay up when they're saying the famous phrase, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And as the dawn rises over the Veneto countryside and a little kind of Castelfranco or Montagnana, little wall town, you see that, the soldiers are coming to capture Christ. But in this case, look, it's back to the Bellini prototype. So influential. We don't have the three musician angels. We've got the three sleeping apostles there. And then on either side, where in front of the columns, the back has been blown out of the chapel to show the landscape, the Veneto landscape. But on either side, we have these figures, again, just like a Sacra Conversazione. That is, they're there not because it's recording any specific time, but rather they reflect the names or perhaps even the specific cult or rituals, prayers of the clients. Now, we saw earlier donor portraits. This is a painting restored by Say Venice about 10 years ago. Cima had the bad luck to be the same generation as Giovanni Bellini, so he was always then and now overshadowed, but a beautiful painting from the Church of the Carità, which is now part of the ensemble of the Accademia, part of those buildings. So it was in the church, now it's in the museum, and I want you to look at the figure second from the left. And that is a figure of St. George, looks right out at us, and it's very specific. It's not the kind of idealized face we saw with the other figures on the same painting. No, this is a donor as St. George. So Giorgio Ragan was his name, and he said, put me in the painting. Not as a little figure up front, but rather one up at the same level, standing in the same space as the saints. So it's these kinds of altarpieces that then influence the smaller scale devotional paintings, not commissioned for churches, but for private homes. Just to go one further, this is Bellini's Evolution 1505. Fantastic coordination of the actual architecture with the painted architecture. The figures now are even stiller and calmer. They're grander. They take up more space. There's a beautiful sense of color. I mean, it's really hard to pull off bright blue and orange and green and purple and red, and Bellini can do it because the control is so great. And even though we see little bits of landscape on either side, he reminds us that we're still in the city of the Basilica of San Marco with the beautiful marbles and mosaics. There's the famous letter that Albrecht Dürer writes from Venice in 1506 to his friend Pirkheimer back up in Nuremberg in Germany, and he writes that Giovanni Bellini is very old, but he is still the best painter of all. And he's clearly thinking of this painting because it was finished just the year before. This must be, for Dürer, the sign of just how great this very elderly artist was. And then the Sacra Conversazione continues, and indeed new ways of thinking about the donor portrait. So this is the Madonna di Carpaccio, restored by Say Venice. So we've got a Sacra Conversazione, but that's been pivoted, in a sense, been pushed back towards the right. The Virgin Child should be in the center, but over to the right. St. Peter should be the left, but he's now in the middle. And you've got donor portraits. So it's Jacopo Pesaro right down there in the bottom left. And then all the male members of the family are on the right. You can see they all have the same nose. They're all relatives, right? But this is a wonderful combination of the donor portrait, or indeed group portrait, with a Sacra Conversazione that's been switched in a big altarpiece form. And this is just about as kind of complicated and fancy as you can get. And you just see the beautiful fabrics. Part of this is that Titian's style is loosening. Part of this also, he's no longer painting exclusively on wooden panels, that very hard, smooth surface. He's now painting on canvas, which has a texture. Canvas has both a kind of weave and a give that allows certain types of shortcuts to be made to convey certain textures beautifully, like satin or velvet or hair or skin. I talked a minute ago about how the influence of Bellini continued for more than a generation. You see that here as well, because this very strong diagonal lower left to upper right in the Madonna di Carpaccio, the Madonna of the House of Pesaro, is so influential that when Paolo Veronese does his first altarpiece in Venice. Look what he does, right? Same sort of composition. So clearly not making a real nod to Titian's work before. So I wanted to end with one of the aspects which I find really appealing and indeed, let's admit it, preferable in the Davis picture, and that is this very beautiful landscape. You know, it's again hard to see on the slide here, but there's in the original, you know, up in the museum, there is beautiful little spiky architecture painted quite delicately in white. There's a nice sense of the landscape, see, of a real distant vista. Little buildings over here. As I said earlier, this could have been recognizable to the client, if not to us. If you own that farm or grew up in that village, you might well recognize it. But this is something of let's say, real creativity done by the artist. What is interesting, though, is it's not just the buildings. There's a sense that the trees are kind of a screen. So you've got these skinny trees there, and then a bigger tree there, and then space beyond that, which is not present in the Louvre prototype. And Peter Ferguson was saying earlier this week, these little trees reminded him a little bit of Perugino, and let's say the art in Umbria from exactly the same moment. One other possibility, though, of viewing a landscape through a screen of trees, in fact, again, like many things in this period, comes out of Giovanni Bellini. And by that, I'm thinking of something like this picture, Assassination of St. Peter Martyr, National Gallery, London. And you can see looking right through that. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is another useful terminus for the Davis picture, that it is not only dependent on the execution of the Louvre picture, but also dependent on the execution of Giovanni Bellini and these kinds of paintings and treatment of landscape. So, as I hope I have shown, and as you will hear with the next two speakers, and I hope they will make clear, that we have here in this donation a beautiful, once beautiful, now somewhat damaged, but nevertheless continuously fascinating piece of Renaissance Venice here in Wellesley. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick, for relieving me of the duty of having to do any art historical context whatsoever, because that's not my specialty, and I do have a lot of things to talk about today with this painting. I have to say, my first glimpse of this painting came somewhere circa 1991. I was on my way home from graduate school from Delaware for some vacation and happened to stop at the Cascale home on the way and remember seeing it, I think, in the dining room, and it was dark and there was stuff around it, so I wasn't actually particularly focused on it, and it never occurred to me that I would then see it at the MFA almost 30 years later in a completely different context. So as I said, I'm just going to be talking about the analysis. I have the Louvre picture on the left there just as a reminder of it. It's a touch point for us to sort of explain certain things that we will see through the technical analysis of the picture. Whenever we start examining, when a painting comes into the studio for examination, the first thing we do is we put really, really bright lights on it and look at it very closely, but just with the naked eye, because in order to understand where we need to go with any kind of technical analysis, we need that starting point just to familiarize ourselves with the painting. So as you can see, we have our little color, temperature, color thing at the bottom there. So this was taken in the studio, and just from the outset, examining it, you could tell that it felt like there were several different hands at work on this painting. The landscape looks very different from many of the figures except for the donor in the bottom area. And to our minds as conservators, when you see that variation in terms of technique, that sets off certain alarm bells and gives us something to really start to focus on. Next, we look at things with a very strong raking light. If you shine a light from the side, very strong light from one side, you start to get a sense of the surface texture and other issues that you might see. We don't have a pointer, so I'm going to try with the cursor all along there. That is a seam. So the original construction of the panel appears to have been two horizontal panels joined at that part. Oftentimes with the panel joints, the paint around those joints suffers as the wood planks move over time. So you can see that the texture of the paint on either side of that line there is quite different. You can see that certain areas, like the drapery around the Virgin's head, the paint appears quite smooth, whereas, for example, in her blue robe, the paint, there's a great deal more surface texture in that area. And you do get a little, not to reflect negatively on the Cascale housekeeping, but there does seem to be a certain layer of grime on the surface, which... And I should point out that this area right there, I believe a beloved grandchild was trying to be very, very helpful and trying to clean the painting, and I think may have gone after it with a little bit of a spray bottle. So that would explain, if you see that up in the galleries, that's what that is. Of course, we had to look at the painting from the back. Very common for panel paintings. The wood is incredibly reactive to humidity. Panels that lived in a constant environment, as would say be in a church in Venice where the humidity was high but constant, might have lived for hundreds of years in excellent condition. But of course, these paintings might then have been sold into homes that suddenly had modern conveniences like indoor heating. And I think we all have the experience when our heat comes on in the fall where the air dries out completely and all hell breaks loose with materials that are sensitive to moisture. So often we find with panel paintings that the panels warp, crack, split, and starting in the 18th, but particularly in the 19th century, it was very common practice to apply a wooden structure like this to the back of the painting called a cradle. The idea of backing the painting with these things was that you would have, in this case, the horizontal members are fixed, but the vertical members are supposed to slide back and forth. And in theory, the idea was that this structure would allow the wood panel to flex a little bit in moderation with changes in relative humidity. In reality, it never worked. And some paintings you can see ended up with this hideous lumpy pattern that we call washboarding, because the movement, the difference between the areas that were restrained and the areas that were free to move was simply too great. So with this, it's very intriguing because the wood that we see on the back is not wood that would be the actual reverse of the painting. Another mystery for us is this was incredibly heavy, and I apologize to all the preparators who had to hang this because this thing weighs a ton. So to the point where we thought perhaps there was even a metal plate behind the original panel. It's also quite thin. It's not even half an inch thick. So we suspected at the time that the panel would have been thinned down, which was very common. A normal Italian panel painting would have been quite thick because the thicker the panel, the less responsive it would be to changes in humidity. But the entirety of this panel is really quite thin. So, and the edges are covered with wooden strips. So short of starting to excavate and take all of that off, we couldn't really say how the panel was constructed, but we did suspect that it had been thinned down quite a bit. Our next step was to look at the painting on ultraviolet light. And you can see it has this kind of crazy turquoisey green glow to it, which is typical of the reaction of natural resin varnish to exposure to ultraviolet light. And it's quite thick, which tells us that there is a great deal of varnish present on the surface. It's unlikely that a painting of this age would come down through the centuries without having been restored multiple times, without having been varnished, possibly over and over and over again. Whether or not it was cleaned in between varnishings is hard to say. Sometimes the application of a new coat of varnish could spruce up a painting enough to make it look better without actually having to clean the painting. We do see some variation in the surface, and if you look in certain areas, like around here next to the donor figure or over here, it has a darker appearance. That can be because maybe the painting was, the surface was messed around a little bit with in those areas, cleaned differently, varnish applied differently. The other thing that you often see in UV is areas where the painting is the appearance is very dark. And you can see certain areas, say up here in the Virgin's face, where you have these dark areas. And when you have that dark purple appearance, that's often, it's hard to categorize how recent, but a fairly recent restoration that is not covered by a thick enough layer of the varnish so that it's invisible. If you don't see that, it doesn't mean that other restoration isn't present. It's just underneath enough varnish that it doesn't actually show. But it did highlight for us in the face of the Virgin, in the face of the female saint, and the body of the Christ child that there was definitely a lot going on in those areas. Our next step was to do an infrared reflectogram, and I'm just going to call it IR because it's too much to just say that over and over again. And I'm in great debt to my former colleague, Caitlin Breer, who's now returned to Australia, but she is a wizard at infrared reflectography, and I have to say there are approximately, I believe, 400 images in this entire mosaic, which she was able to stitch together so seamlessly. She's really a wizard at this stuff, and I appreciate her having done that for me. The infrared, if you shine warm lights onto the surface of a painting that has light in their infrared spectrum, it reflects back into the camera and allows us to, the sensor in the camera sorts out materials that are absorbent to infrared light and materials that are not. And fortunately for art historians and for conservators, the materials that artists would have used for underdrawing of various types, whether it's charcoal drawing, sketching in with ink, or with, say, an earth pigment paint, those are all carbon-containing pigments, and infrared, those are absorbed in infrared, so we can actually see through that upper layer of paint into the underdrawing layers, courtesy of IR. And so, sort of overall, with this, it does start to give us various clues about the nature of what we see in this painting. Here are a few details of the deer. I love the deer. I think the deer might actually be my favorite part of the painting. The bird, and of course the face of the donor. And if you can look past the damages such as you see in his face, you can see all the different areas of the shape of the hat that was changed. It appears to be multiple times. His hair, you could see the delicacy of the drawing in his lips. Actually, it's really quite beautiful. So, you know, there are those areas that in infrared really are quite lovely. On the other hand, if you look at the at the infrared image of both the Virgin and the older male saint, they look. It's very clear that they are not of the 16th century. There's a sort of sketchiness of the painting, the broad brushstrokes of the painting of the male saint there that is completely unlike anything you would see at that time. And for the figure of the Virgin, it just has a sort of plastic and slightly generic quality to it that you would also not see, in sharp contrast to what appears to be more original paint surrounding it that has a completely different texture. And you can see how, particularly with the drapery of the Virgin there, it's very solid, and it appears to not have cracks or any of the kind of marks you would expect from older paint. So that was a very important clue for us. After that, we took the X-ray. This is a composite of approximately 20 plates, which I have to say I'm indebted to my colleague Louise Orsini, because we struggled through this. As I mentioned, and I'll say it again, this is a really heavy painting. So for us to have to try and manipulate it to take all of these exposures was quite an endeavor, and it was wonderful to have a colleague to help me with this. If you think back to the image that I showed of the reverse of the painting, you may remember the very heavy cradle that was on the back. When you look at it, you can still see images of some of the horizontal bars and some of the vertical bars. In the original X-ray images, that cradle is almost all that you can see from the plates, because of the way that the X-ray energy passes through the painting and then onto the detection plate behind it. The cradle is almost, it's more apparent than the actual painting is. So we are very fortunate that we have colleagues, conservator and scientists at Duke University, who came up with an algorithm that we can use to cancel the cradle digitally through each of the plates. It only goes so far, however, and I must say I spent many days in Photoshop trying to lessen the effect of the cradle, because otherwise you really can't register anything about the painting. So this is a real labor of love here, I have to say, and I confess that you may wonder what this is. And while we missed a segment where we did not overlap 2 of the X-ray plates, 2 out of the 20 plates there. So that's just a little gap, and I'm so sorry about that. But by the time we realized it, the painting was actually on its way back to you. So that was the end of that. The X-ray tells us so many things. First and foremost, there is no metal plate, because if there were a metal plate in there, it would have been a completely white X-ray, and we would have no information whatsoever. Therefore, we know that the heaviness of the painting comes from the wood of either the backing of the painting and or the cradle. Most Italian paintings were painted on poplar. It is not a particularly heavy wood. It's also not a particularly quality wood and very prone to insect damage. But it is not heavy in the way that this painting is. So that's clue number 1. Clue number 2, we did not see any wood grain in this X-ray. Under normal circumstances, if you were to blow up details of this painting, you would see the wood grain that would have been filled by the preparation, the artist's preparation, and possibly, and the fill material of the preparation layer would fill in some of the wood grain so that you would see that in the X-ray, and we don't see that here. There are a few areas, such as in there where you see worm damage, where the worms, the insects would have tunneled through the wood, and then some of that material would have been filled in with an X-ray opaque material, maybe some lead white. So we see that, but only in a few areas, and in particular along the joint of the two panels. So what this said to us is that we are pretty sure that the panel would have been transferred onto a new wooden support. And in some radical instances, when there is a great deal of damage to the panel, it isn't just that the wood panel is thinned down, which was typical in many cases, but that the wood actually may have been completely removed from the reverse of the panel, leaving only the preparation layer and the paint layers and the varnish layers. This is often done, I mean, this is usually only done in sort of more dramatic circumstances when there's a great problem with the panel itself or with the paint layers, but the lack of any kind of wood grain here tells us that something was wrong with the panel, and it may, in fact, no longer be present. And that might also go a long way towards explaining the extent of the damage that we see all throughout the paint layers. And in particular, if you look at if you look, for example, at this area up here, where you see all of those black areas are areas of loss of the original paint. That kind of pinpoint loss you can often see in a panel that has been transferred because, you know, the process is stressful to the paint. And if the paint is at all unsound, it can really cause bits, microflaking, little bits of the paint to come off. These images are up here to sort of give you a sense of kind of what's not here. If you look at the face of the Virgin, these areas in here, which the details of her lips, of her chin, those would have been in a normal X-ray, they would be quite opaque. They would look white or gray, light gray, because the lead white that would have been used in those areas would highlight all of those details. The fact that it's dark there tells us that that material is missing in a great quantity there. And then if you look down here at the head of the Christ child, all you really kind of have down there is the area from the eyes, the nose, and the chin, and the cheek. And then what is in his head, well, there's not much in his head. So that raises a lot of questions about sort of the condition there. And then you see, once again, all of this pinpoint loss in his body there. And even with the naked eye, when you go see the painting in the gallery, you can tell that there is a very interesting texture to the flesh there. Over here, this is the figure of Sebastian. So where is Sebastian? What happened to Sebastian? Where did he go? So we have Sebastian's arm over here. We have kind of some of his other arm over there. And then, like, what? Where is he? So we don't have an answer for this. It's, is he unfinished? Did something so dramatic happen to that figure that the paint is just simply gone there? I mean, we can't answer that question just through our technical analysis, but the fact that there's just really nothing to see of the facial features, of the flesh, which would have been, under normal circumstances, the flesh would have been all lead white and other pigments mixed in, so you could have seen quite a lot of detail in a normal X-ray. And you do still see all the highlights of the drapery there, so that that is relatively intact, and there's plenty of lead white that gives you the shape of the curves of the drapery and the knot there. So Sebastian is very much a mystery to us. One thing that was very exciting to see in the X-ray is so this is the X-ray on the left. I put the saint, the older saint in the upper left from the Louvre picture on your right, because then it's a little challenging to see. But underneath that sort of crazy, 19th century looking male figure with his big mustache is actually, I think, some very delicate painting there. And you can see that would be the forehead. You can see the little strokes of the brushwork of the gray hair there. There's his nose, his lips in there, all of the brushwork of his beard. I think that's his eye. They're very similar. So I can't say how much of this is intact underneath all of that overpaint, but there is enough of that figure there that it shows up in the X-ray, and it's very tantalizing. And it was all I could do not to, I was sort of really tempted to do a few cleaning tests when the painting was in our studio. And my boss said, oh, no, you don't. Because that could be opening up a can of worms that really nobody wants to open. But it was very hard to restrain myself from doing that. The final step in our analysis is we did take cross-sections from certain areas. We take really pinpoint tiny specks of paint. They're embedded in a resin cube. They're sliced in half so that the paint sections look like a piece of layer cake. The sections are polished and then examined under the microscope. And I just put this up there just to show you that that's the paint sample. Just to give you an idea of the size. We're not digging out big old chunks of the painting there. So sometimes some of our curators get a little anxious when we ask to take a cross-section because they're convinced that we're going to walk off with way more paint than we should. But I just wanted to reassure everybody that's the kind of size of the sample that we took. So I have to once again say how much I am indebted to Louise Orsini. She is our resident guru of cross-section analysis. She takes the most beautiful samples and does the most beautiful and thorough photography. In this case, as you will see with these sections, it was so interesting to our senior conservation scientist, Richard Newman, that he just spontaneously examined them with SEM because he just thought they were so crazy. So. This is a diagram of where the samples were taken from. Louise took 5 samples. 2 of them didn't survive the polishing process, which is very typical for us when we are taking samples because they're such small specks that when you are polishing them, it is inevitable that you might polish the speck right out of the cube. So we have 3 just very intriguing cross-sections that survived. So this first one is a sample taken from Sebastian's chest. And in an area that, judging by the X-ray, we figured there might actually be some chance of there being original paint. So I think it's pretty well spelled out in the cross-section at the top. The original paint left is, oh dear, I'm having trouble with this mouse. There's a little bit right in there. So then we have alternating layers of both retouching and varnish. This is the same, and I should say this is 200 times magnification, just to give you a sense. It looms large up on the screen there, but it's actually just, up smaller than a pinhead. And this is the UV illuminated version of that same cross-section. And you can see it starts very much looking like a layer cake with the varnish as the sort of turquoise blue frosting in between layers of, the original paint, varnish, overpaint, varnish, overpaint, varnish. So where there is original paint, it is not a continuous layer, is I think the message that this particular sample was giving to us in the figure of Saint Sebastian. So this is sample number 4, which was taken from the Virgin's forehead. This was the one that got Richard so incredibly excited. Total of 26 layers, exclamation mark, it says down there in the report. We don't see cross-sections like this normally in paintings. And it was just, we were all just kind of stunned, because not just from the number of layers of overpaint, but the fact that so many of the layers were separated by varnish. So it's impossible to say how many times somebody went after the forehead of the Virgin, but it does give you a sense that clearly people felt something was wrong and they needed to go at it over and over again. And of course, our original paint is right there. So all of those other layers are varnish and restoration, and they're quite beautiful as, sort of imagery, all these different layers and the sparkling of all the pigments inside. And then here is the backscattered electron image that gives you a sense that down there would be the original pigment there in those little white layers of the lead white there. And that is probably a layer of restoration that contains, a thick layer of restoration that contains lead white in it. And the final section comes from the male figure in the upper left. And the one thing that this section does show us is that there is what appears to be a pretty continuous layer of original paint in that bottom layer there, which, it looks like some weird stack of pancakes. The way all of the different restoration layers are on top of it, but the fact that there does seem to be a continuous paint layer in that bottom layer is encouraging in the fact that, there might be something left in that figure. So I haven't answered any questions, particularly about, when it was restored, how it was restored, how many times it was restored, because it was clearly restored many, many, many times. But it was very interesting to explore all the different layers, really work through the layer structures of this panel, and really use most of the tools that we have at our disposal at the MFA to examine it and hopefully give something for Wellesley students to puzzle over themselves in the same way that we have puzzled over it. And I think at that point, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine to let her go on.
Hello, I am Kate Davies, and I was one of the co-curators of this exhibit with Alicia Latours, which was a very exciting project for me to work on. The process of creating this exhibit for me felt honestly like a bit of a final love letter to the Davis Museum after 4 years at Wellesley College and specifically the Davis Museum. I began 4 years ago as a tour guide at the Davis. I honestly just felt like I needed something to do apart from classes, so I applied to be a tour guide, and Liz Gardner, who's no longer at the Davis, took a shot and was like, yeah, like, let's see where this goes. And each year I applied to another program because I just loved it, and each year I just kept taking on more and more responsibilities. I ended up being a Davis summer intern, a co-curator of the Davis Museum Student Advisory Council, a curatorial assistant, and ultimately the DeLorme intern. And over those 4 years, with the guidance of everybody at the Davis and all their different vicinities, I felt I grew professionally, academically, and also personally. And I certainly would not be who I am or where I am today without the endless support, advice, and guidance from everybody at the Davis that I interacted with. And as a result, I was the DeLorme intern, and I believe it was actually March of my senior spring when I finally began to look at this painting. It started a bit earlier than the summer with a lot of archival research. When this painting was first in possession of the Catskills, they hired art historian Seth Thayer to help place the painting and had done some provenance research in the early 1960s. Seth Thayer had been an assistant curator, art consultant, and museum director over his years. And in his research, he was able to discover information about the provenance, a few articles written specifically about the Davis work, and found some notes, handwritten notes, written by art historian Bernard Berenson about our painting and its relationship to the Louvre work. It was this research that provided the basis for Alicia Latours to start looking into it, and Claire had asked Alicia to look over all the documentation to find out just a bit more generally about the work. Alicia shortly discovered a third version in addition to the one at the Davis and the one in the Louvre. This third version had come up for auction in 2017. And here are all three of the works pictured: the Davis in the upper left, the Louvre in the upper right, and then the third painting, which is now in a private European collection, in the center. When the painting was first offered to the Davis, it was clear there had been prior restoration efforts. In addition to a varnish layer and paint loss visible in the body of the baby Jesus and areas like the head of Saint Sebastian, there was also a few different hands visible. As the Catskills had begun provenance research on the panel, they were already aware of the version in the Louvre, and we had found the private European collection. And as we dug deeper, Alicia found another version located in the home of a private collector in New Orleans. And throughout this entire process, we've actually found a total of 6 different iterations of this Sacra Conversazione. At first, we wondered why our painting was so different from the other versions of the work. In the Italian Renaissance, it was not uncommon for artists to mimic works for their patrons, and therefore what surprised us most was not that there were a total of 6 different versions, but that ours was so drastically different from the others. Displayed here are the Louvre version, a version of the painting from a private European collection that Alicia found, and the Davis's. It's clear from a visual analysis that the Davis's version is markedly different. In comparison to the Louvre version, ours has a different donor, a different Saint Sebastian, and a different Saint Joseph. Alterations in the infant Jesus and other figures, as well as a drastically different background in the landscape. While both the Louvre version and ours depict a tree behind Saint Sebastian, the Catskill painting, or the Davis painting, also depicts several smaller trees, a sprawling hillside, and a few birds. The Louvre and the European paintings both depict a single dark mountain and a cloudy sky. Interestingly, though different from the other paintings, the background of the Catskill painting seems to be original. The X-rays and infrareds indicate that the initial artists of this work who chose to use a different background. The donor and Saint Joseph are also markedly different from figures in the private collection of from the paintings in the private collection and Louvre paintings. In the Catskill painting, the Saint Joseph appears with a darker head of hair, a beard, a darker cloak, and is in profile view. In the Louvre version, the Saint Joseph appears in a bright yellow cloak with gray hair, a gray beard, and is shown in three-quarter view. The donor in the Louvre version is shown in profile with a beard and no cap. The Davis version is shown in three-quarter view with a cap and no beard. In the Louvre version, the Saint Sebastian looks off to the corner of the painting, and the cloth around his waist has no stripes. His wounds are clean, and his musculature is carefully shaded and defined. In the Davis version, Saint Sebastian makes direct eye contact with the viewer. Blood drips from his arrow wounds, and his loincloth is longer and now striped, and his musculature is not as carefully defined. The hand of the infant Jesus in the Louvre painting is also different, as the fingers are carefully articulated around the hand of the Mary Magdalene, while in the Davis version, the hands are drastically simplified. The painting in the private collection is certainly closer in composition to the Louvre painting than the Davis, but it certainly has suffered damage over the years. Compared to the Davis painting, the work in the European private collection has many of the same differences as the Louvre. Same differences as the Louvre. Namely, the donor, the Saint Sebastian, and the Saint Joseph, and the infant Jesus are all different from the Davis version. Based purely on the condition of the work and the differences between the other versions, we are rather certain that there have been a number of conservation campaigns over the years, which is confirmed by the MFA through the technical analysis. As we've just heard, the painting conservation team at the MFA conducted a technical analysis of the painting via UV light, infrared reflectography, X-rays, and cross-sections of the paint layers to see beneath that initial surface that you see when you go into the galleries to look at the painting. The X-rays and infrared imaging were significant. The X-rays use radiation to create a picture of the layers that compose the painting beneath what you can see. Similarly, the infrared radiation passes through the paint layers until it hits something that absorbs it, allowing art historians to see the underlayers of the painting. For X-rays, heavier substances such as metallic pigments like that lead white block X-rays and result in opaque areas, whereas X-rays easily pass through sections that have paint loss. For infrareds, carbon-based pencils used to create underdrawings or other dark pigments will absorb the infrared radiation and appear as a darker line. The dark figure of Saint Sebastian in the X-rays indicate a lack of lead white in the paint and was predominantly used to create the white lead color in the 19th and 20th centuries. So if you look at the painting roughly in this area, kind of at the donor, in the X-rays and infrared, you can see those changes in the donor, those under layers. And we were actually thinking that perhaps you can see the changes in the cap and the hair, but also a slight profile. And perhaps initially it had been much more like the Louvre version, perhaps even looking like the original donor figure. And to go back, so looking at that original donor figure, you can really see that profile and that hair that is then present. Here. And so the technical analysis certainly confirmed for us that there were initial differences between what you could see and what was underneath, but also confirmed that it likely looked much similar to the Louvre version. The X-rays revealed drastically different faces for the St. Joseph as well. The St. Joseph in the infrared has a different profile and longer hair, as was brought up earlier, kind of visible here with that very delicate painting. And interestingly, there are very few changes to the background of the painting. So like what was said before, it's very likely that the background of the painting was a choice by that original painter in order to please the donor. So if you look in the background, those trees are present. Initially, the birds are still present, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of changes with the underlayers between what is seen today and what's seen in the infrared and X-rays. It is also likely that the painting was transferred from its original wooden panel to a new support. This is typical of Renaissance panel paintings, as they did warp over time. They could bend and split, altering and damaging the ground layers and paint layers on top of it. The X-rays support the conclusion that the painting had been transferred from the initial panel to a new panel. The wood grain is not visible. There are wormholes present. And this dark line that you can see in the painting is not actually visible on the panel that you see in the current painting. If you were to go to the Davis and flip the painting over, the current panel it's on doesn't have that line where paint had fallen into the original panel as a result of warping over time. To better understand the changes we saw in the technical analysis, we began to do some archival research. We began our research with Dr. Bernard Berenson, a prominent specialist in Italian art during the 19th century. Dr. Berenson was aware of both the Davis and the Louvre versions in his scholarship and wrote about both in an article titled A Sacra Conversazione in the Louvre, published by Chapman and Hall in London in 1958. Berenson argues against the previous attributions for the Louvre painting and instead makes the argument that the Louvre painting was painted by Domenico Manci. In this article, Berenson also states that he had seen the Catskill painting, and he describes it as by a 10th-rate painter whose hand I have recognized elsewhere. It was made for a donor who wanted his portrait instead of one of the original, the one in the Louvre version, and a fairly common procedure with Bellini-esque pictures. The article also provided a general background for the work and gave us a bit more insight into the sales of the work, and so we began to dig into further archival research. We knew from the Catskills, previous provenance research conducted in the 1960s, that the painting was owned by Sir William James Farrer and sold via Christie's in London in 1912. We were able to find a copy of the actual auction catalog, and it is shown here. The copy of Christie's catalog notes that the Madonna, in a red dress and green cloak, seated, holding the infant Savior on her lap, St. Joseph stands behind her, St. Catherine and St. Sebastian and a donor before her. Farrer himself had a large collection of old master paintings and took a very detailed inventory of his collection, which was printed in 1982. The collection of this inventory detailed the location of each object in his home, as well as the condition of the work and if he had done any restoration campaigns while it was in his house. The Holy Family and Saints was listed as a Giorgione, which was an attribution given to many Venetian works without an artist in the 19th century and was described as the white, blue, and purple original tints of the Virgin's robes had been repainted into gray and black. On examination, I had found the white and purple in good order, but the blue had been injured and is now restored. As the Christie's catalog from the Farrer estate sale in 1912 notes that the Virgin's robes are now red and green and not gray and black, one can assume that Farrer altered the work while it was in his home between 1892 and 1912. Sir William Graham, the man that Farrer bought the painting from, was a Scottish politician and a wine importer, who was an avid collector of both old masters and contemporary art. An ardent supporter of the Pre-Raphaelites, he is a close friend and patron of Edward Burne-Jones, amongst others. Though we were able to find archival information on his collection, we were unable to find anything related to the Davis and Catskill paintings specifically. We have as of yet been unable to locate records explaining how this painting came into Graham's collection and if the work underwent any alterations with Graham. It is unclear who purchased the work in 1912 from Farrer's Christie's auction, but we picked up the trail again with Hans Schaefer in 1921. Hans Schaefer owned the Schaefer Galleries in Berlin and then in New York and specialized in selling old master paintings. He and his wife Kate settled in the U.S. permanently in 1933, but only closed the gallery in Berlin in 1939. The work then immigrated to the United States with Hans' sister Lilo Schaefer Catskill and her husband Joseph. It then was passed down through the family to Peter and Joan Macy Catskill, Wellesley College class of 1953, and then it was donated to the Davis in 2007. The Schaefer Gallery archives are currently housed at the Getty Research Institute and contain object files for all the works that are passed through the Schaefer Gallery. A file for this particular painting was located in a box of files that said artworks in restoration, clearly identifying that this panel was a work that the Schaefers had restored. The files contain a photograph of the work as it must have looked in the early 1920s when Hans acquired the work, and possibly even what it looked like after it had left the Farrar's collection in 1912. As noted, Bernard Berenson printed this photo in his essay, and had also taken a note on the back and labeled it "Formerly of the Farrar Collection, London." This image clearly reveals that there are more conservation campaigns to come, as St. Sebastian and Joseph are drastically different from their present appearance. So you can see, so this is a shorter loincloth, though it is still striped. St. Sebastian looks away instead of at us. There's a lot of loss in the definition of the torso, and if you look at that St. Joseph, he looks very similar to the Louvre version and almost nothing like the current version in the Davis Museum. And so from this archival research, we know that while it was in Farrar's collection, the Mary Magdalene was repainted, her robes specifically, from gray and black to the red and green they are currently. We also know that before it had entered the Farrar collection, the robes were originally purple and blue. So that's 3 times that Mary, we know for sure and have archival evidence of Mary being repainted. We can visually see that Sebastian has been repainted, and we can see that, or will be repainted after 1920, and we can see that St. Joseph will be repainted after 1920. We can also see that the donor has already been repainted, so that happened well before 1920. And those are the only real dates we have for the restoration campaigns. We saw in the paint samples there have been a series of alterations over the years in order to make the look more like however the current owner believed it would have looked initially, or changed it to make it look however the owner wanted it to look. But these are the only changes we have evidence for in archival records. Today, the painting contains the hands of numerous artists. While some changes are visible on the surface, such as the looser brushstrokes of St. Joseph, others, such as the original donor figure, require the aid of technology to see. Ultimately, the centuries of retouching and alterations have resulted in the object's present condition at the Davis Museum. While there are some questions we cannot answer, such as who the original painter was, the research has provided a clear idea of the present state of the work and what it might have looked like at various points in its life in the past. And then finally, this is what you will see today in the Davis Museum if you go up to look at the painting following this lecture. And again, what you see today is not what it's looked like its whole life. And there are many layers beneath this that depict what it looked like at different points in time.
Thank you so much to our 3 presenters. If you wouldn't mind coming up, I will, turn the lights back on, and we will take some questions. I'm sure there are many. So thank you, all 3. I actually would like to start out with a question for Lydia. And if you wouldn't mind explaining kind of the decision behind not going forward with the cleaning and possible steps that might be taken in the future for this work.
Well, let's see. I think we in conservation try very hard to make everything we do reversible, but there are very few things in conservation that are absolutely not reversible, and cleaning is one of those things. So that if we were to start, short of my restoring back to the restoration, we have very little knowledge of what we might find. Now, one could argue, and I was sort of trying to maybe argue, that it could be really interesting if the painting is destined to be used as more of a teaching tool, as a didactic object in a way, as opposed to really thinking about it as a work of beautiful Renaissance painting, then it might be very interesting to show, sort of to work through those layers and to see what's going on. Some people are really frightened by paint in damaged condition, and it can be, if you sort of see that without a context and without a knowledge of what's going on, it can be very disturbing to see. So these would be all considerations of whether or not to proceed. And sometimes not doing something is really the best action. To not take action is the best action.
Just to add a little bit, though, also conservation, like any kind of interpretation, comes in degrees or various amounts of extent. And I would say that a painting damaged like this in a college museum like the Davis might be left more comfortably there. Also, in fact, it's part of the educational mission that you can have a lot of information on the walls about the extent of damage. At a museum like the Museum of Fine Arts, we would probably want things more retouched. But if this were by any chance on the market, I can promise you the dealer would have it completely retouched. It would look sparkling. And only when you got the black light, the UVA out, would you notice, really. And this goes for not just the overall appearance, but things that might not have been, or presumably are not the artist's original intention. That is, we use the word pentimento or pentiment, which is a visible correction. When the ear was originally higher, or there was a little tree in the back that was painted out. Over time, those typically become visible as the paint layers, darken or lighten unevenly. A college museum will be very happy to have pentimenti, things sticking out in the background of a painting. A museum like the MFA, we'd probably tone it down, and the dealer would make it very clean. They'd have a photograph of that to prove that it was an original, right? Because only major artists make changes, in theory, not copyists. But really, there's a kind of idea that something for the market should look as close to pristine as possible, as if it was painted yesterday. And sometimes, in fact, it was.
Any questions? Yes.
First of all, thank you to the three of you. It was just wonderful to have such different perspectives on this painting that I shared my dining room with for so many years. So my main question is, and this was so fascinating, looking at all the different figures and all the changes, it seems that one thing all of you have been saying is that the landscape in the background is pretty much intact, and as it was. And I'm curious, because I think one thing that I'm still wondering, and I need some affirmation on that. Does that then tell you that this is a Renaissance painting? I mean, is there any doubt that the painting was done much later than we're talking about, stylistically, either based on that landscape or, are we...
I would say from a technical standpoint, it's consistent with, and notice how I'm fudging over making any kind of commitment, but certainly it's consistent material-wise with painting of that period. And, sort of from my viewpoint, the landscape, the tree, the squirrel, the deer, the leaves, all that stuff, I would absolutely, accept that as 16th century Italian painting. And certain things like what the X-ray shows of the figure of St. Joseph, I would say that too. It's what happened to the rest of it that is just interesting. And I feel like also the donor portrait, it has all those changes, but I feel like they're old changes.
And there are many ways, Alison. There are a whole bunch of different scenarios we could have. We could have, I think it's a follower sense of Sebastiano da Piombo, someone not trained in the workshop, let's say a medium ability who gets given a specific instruction. I want a version by a donor, by a client says, I would love that kind of Sacra Conversazione. Same saints, but put my face in. And then that follower may have painted the person in profile first, and then midway through switched, or so looking out 3/4, or that could have been a replacement face soon after. I mean, in theory, something like this, destined for someone's home, the guy never pays it. So you put a new face on there and you turn it a little bit more or something like that. Or, the guy dies and the brother says, I want my face on it. So we're only a few years later, right? Potentially. I mean, what you're just asking, could this be a 19th century imitation Renaissance painting? I don't think so. 18th century, yeah, it doesn't. I mean, the one that's in a private European collection you have a color photo of, I mean, that's considerably smaller. That's a copy, I would say, of someone who goes to the Louvre, does not know this in the Renaissance, doesn't know it in the Venetian context. It's not like some artist saw it in some palazzo, but rather that I think that someone goes to the Louvre, and paints the picture from that. It's considerably smaller, and it's so close to the Louvre one. I think that's my opinion. I've never seen that. All I know is the photograph that we have and knowledge of the dimensions. But it just seems, it's like someone following that, someone who loves early 16th century Venice, who loves big names like Sebastiano and Giorgione. So that's what I would think.
I would also add to that, not that it gives it a date, but the fact that there are 26 layers on the Virgin's face, I think that takes time, right? That's not going to happen over 100 years.
Over time, yeah.
Exactly. So that in and of itself, I think, argues for a much later date.
Yeah.
Doesn't chemical analysis show different compositions of the paint in different periods?
Well, in order for us to do a more in-depth analysis in terms of all the pigments and binding media and things like that, for one thing, we'd have to take much larger samples, and we didn't feel that was appropriate.
But also, if you're using traditional materials, I mean, like you ground up lapis lazuli, it's as old as stone. I mean, that's not really help. I mean,
now, if you did it yesterday and put it on and it dried properly, then you could say, yeah, this is Renaissance lapis lazuli.
Yes, I mean, when you're trying to...
Lapis lazuli, period, end of story.
We would have to look for pigments, we'd have to look for Prussian blue that came out in the 18th century, or we'd have to find titanium white that came out in the 19th century, and any of those sorts of clues. But we didn't really have time to do that, and as I said, we would have had to have taken much larger samples. Let me just say that we are very much hoping the Gardner did a really beautiful technical study of their Titian painting of Europa. It's just magnificent. And they use this XRF mapping technique that we are putting in a big plug to get our hands on to one of these pieces of equipment. So if anybody would like to donate to the MFA, I know I'm at the Davis, but I'm just going to toss that out there because why not? What this does is it gives literally a map across the entire surface of the painting that tells you where all different pigments are located. So in theory, if there were different modern pigments, those would show up. The areas where we might find remnants of original pigments would become clearer. We might have more of a sense of, the areas where things are missing, if what original material might be left and something like that, but we don't currently have that technology. So we're just going to have to wait on that, and if Wellesley manages to get a lovely alumna who would like to donate to them one of those machines, we'd happily come over and do that for you. So
I should say one other thing is that a really great clue, of course, is just the visuals, the appearance of something. But in this case, that we have a painting that may have been painted hypothetically in 2 campaigns, or at least changed, and then restored, half a dozen times maybe, major ones, and then lots of revarnishing of it. And so it's really hard to know what's really firm. what is interesting is that, okay, let's go by the scenario that it's actually, a 19th century, so sometime before, William James Farrar, early 19th century imitation. Renaissance painting, it would look like an early 19th century painting, not like an early 16th century painting. It's too hard to understand this, in this case. But, I'm often reminded when I was a freshman or so in high school, sophomore, I guess, whatever, there was the movie Amadeus came out, and everyone was saying, oh my gosh, it's, the most faithful evocation of Mozart's Vienna. Well, now it looks like, mid or early 80s Ralph Lauren. I mean, it's not at all 1780. It's very much 1980. And these things give themselves away. And you see this in conservation treatments where someone retouches the face with, like, say, the makeup style or the hair of the 1920s or 1970s or whatever. But the difficulty here is this painting, there's not enough secure what is old or even new, because we've had, it looks like, from the surface that certain treatments have been redone and adapted. Well, let's just leave that well enough alone, but I'll work on the eyebrow or whatever. And so that's very hard to know what period or mix of periods we're talking about.
I also think there was some paint analysis of the chemicals used to make the paint, and in the upper layers of all the paint samples was cadmium sulfate, which wasn't used to the 19th or 20th centuries. So we certainly know that those top layers were done in the 19th and 20th centuries. But apart from that, we're not sure as to when within those centuries or who or why.
And I have to say, you see different things in a different context, and I am embarrassed to admit that I never noticed the foot of the baby Jesus sort of being tucked under the other leg. But when I looked at the large-scale version of the X-ray sitting there after you showed it, all of a sudden I thought, oh yes, there are the toes. And I'm embarrassed, but I am openly admitting I didn't see that before. And now I'm thinking, oh yes. So I think your idea of just covering it up because it was damaged was...
Alicia mentioned that, I think, or Jackie did, or someone did,
yes.
but it was a...
So yes, I think that's absolutely, it's there. The toes are there.
So, Lillian, you were going to say?
Just going back for a second to the donor portrait, do I understand from a technical point of view that the layers as you interpret them might mean that what we now see was done at a fairly early restoration, at a fairly early moment?
I mean,
entire history?
whether it would be a restoration or simply a sort of reworking, yeah, I think it's, I mean, we didn't actually take a cross-section in that area. Usually we look for things like a layer of grime or a layer of varnish separating the different paint layers to tell us whether something is a later restoration, but even then, that can be deceptive because some artists took their paintings back decades later and repainted them. So,
not from a technical point of view, but from an art historical point of view, it looks rather more like late 15th century. It looks...
Yeah, no, I agree. Something
a later type of head.
An earlier type of head, you mean? Yeah. No, there's a kind of gauntness that seems more Quattrocento compared to the sort of fuller, you think with the Cinquecento. Yeah.
It might have been asked for by someone who was familiar with earlier.
Right. But now we're the one thing, Lillian, we're in so many shifting possibilities. I mean, we could even have, this is a posthumous donor portrait, right? That's what my dad looked like, put him in, and we have a Quattrocento portrait of him. So, I mean, the pity is that there are almost infinite scenarios, and we can't cross out that many, but, can't strike them out as impossible because, indeed, the condition makes it complicated to do any kind of judge definitively.
But Lillian, I think Lydia has pointed out in the past that at least the loss looks very similar to the background, which we do think is original. So just the state of the paint itself does look to be fairly early on. Peter?
Is there any link with the animals? You've got a deer, a moth, a squirrel, and two birds. In Giovanni Bellini's pictures, they all have an iconographical meaning. Is there any linkage of the four animals
That is an excellent question. It's likely, but it is also an avenue we have yet to research. There's a lot about this painting that we still have to really explore and dig into, and that is something that we do have to look into. There's another question?
Peter Ferguson stole my question. But I was interested specifically in the birds, and maybe the answer is you haven't done that research yet. But it struck me that when the three of you were laying out the differences between the Louvre painting and the Davis painting, and you commented on various figures in the background and so on, and what's different between them, nobody talked about the birds, which strikes me as one of the substantial differences. And I think I understood you to say that it appears that the birds are not a later addition, as far as we can tell. We think that the paint suggests that they're like the background and therefore an original. So therefore, maybe they could be some kind of a clue to what's happening in the painting. And my question was exactly the same as Peter's then. What's the iconographical significance of those particular kinds of birds? I'm not an ornithologist, I have no idea. But are those the kinds of birds that one might find in the Veneto, for example, or not?
Yeah, do not. Sorry, I'm stumped. I do not know myself. I mean, they a bit like Lillian's point of the donor portrait seem a little retardataire, a little, I mean, you generally don't have. I mean, it really seems like more of a 15th century thing than a 16th. You've got these big or getting big grand figures, and these seem a little bit like quotations from a sort of late medieval model book, like you'd find in an Illumination or an earlier thing. They are beautiful, and they are clearly a lot of pains went into them. And so then you get another scenario that the Davis picture, right, was a artist who did sort of old-fashioned things like landscape with animals and said, I guess I could copy the Sebastiano and put your face in. But I mean, they are a point of focus or attention, and that shouldn't be ignored. I mean, there could be a symbolic reason for it. Also, the beauty of God's earth and the kind of wonderful thing that that landscape painting in Italy is kind of invented in Venice, which has really no greenery, and nice irony there. But and I suppose, the one thing is it's distinctive enough and not based on Sebastiano. We might find somewhere another painting with a similar squirrel, bird, deer, etc. So maybe another way to think of aligning it with another picture.
It is still an avenue that I'm thinking about and have to research more of, but I have talked to one scholar about it who thinks they might also lead back to the donor figure and allude to his name, which, that is a possibility, but I think having a probably more general symbolic meaning is probably more likely. Okay, I think we probably have time for one more question. Lisa.
So it seems clear from all the work you've done that this painting has experienced a lot of intervention over time, right? Why? Why was it seen to be valuable enough to warrant this repeated campaigns of restoration? Why would people have done that?
Well, one, we know of several sales, right? And what you ideally have is, we'll just put in a plug for the MFA, our Monet collection in part is in such good condition because Monet sold the paint to Durand Royal, who sent it to his gallery in Paris or New York, and then it bought by a Bostonian, and it stayed over a sofa in Beacon Hill for 80 years, and then the great-grandchildren or whatever gave it to the museum. So it was only once on the market. Something that's on the market more than one time gets reframed, it gets transferred from one panel to a canvas or one panel to another, get lining canvases put on, dimensions change, and his tastes change. Giorgione, who was unknown in the 1600s, becomes super big deal in the late 1800s, and everyone wants one, and maybe a conservator would say, give me an hour, or give me a month, and I can make it look a little more like a Giorgione. Soften this, change the landscape like that. So that's one thing. What you didn't notice is anything painted out. That covered, like nudity of Christ covered, or a figure totally blocked out. That also you get real whole scale changes where figures are just eliminated, or people are put on top of others to disguise something else.
Yeah, and you do sometimes get kind of catastrophic things that can happen just accidentally.
A candle burn or a tear or whatever, yeah.
Exactly, and that might cause, that's what I'm thinking in some ways about the Sebastian figure, is there has to be something more than just, a little flaking here and there to cause it to just be gone through that whole central area. And without the evidence of the original panel so that we can't see if there was a split there or a knot of wood that would have done something. We can't pinpoint it, can't put the blame on some specific event. And painters of that time were trained really well. So from a technical standpoint, from the paint itself, it usually withstood the test of time quite well.
Yeah, I mean, Renaissance paintings were made to last, right?
Yeah.
A quick question for you, though, as co-curator. What was for you the best part of this whole exhibition research and project?
I think it was finding the original scans of both the sales catalog and Farr's collection sales catalog and then his private collection. Those were great. I do love British collectors because they digitize everything these days. So we were actually able to get scans of those, which was fantastic, and read the original documents, not physically, but online, which was fantastic. And it gave a lot of evidence for specific restorations. It was also nice to have that provenance research because, to go back to that, the two prior owners were significant British collectors, and it's not only been attributed to Giorgione, it was also attributed to Sebastiano del Piombo at one point. And throughout its life, it was owned by impressive figures in the pre-Raphaelite era in England, and those collectors had a lot of money and really cared about the Italian Renaissance, and so for them, this painting might have been worth it to restore because it meant something to those owners personally.
And also at that time, the Louvre one went into the collection in 1870, so that probably was well known at that time. Great. Well, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to our three amazing presenters.